Hello, guardians of sustainability. Welcome to a new episode where we discuss the upcoming eco-design regulation and where we explain digital product passport, the technology that will probably change the whole product management. Joining us today is Matthew Ekholm, strategic manager at Protokol and an expert for DPP solutions. Together, we'll explore what the digital product passport really is, how it works, and how it can drive transparency, enable circular business models, and ensure compliance with the latest EU regulations. If you are curious about the tools that will power circular economy and transform value chains across the industries, this episode is really for you. So let's get started. Hello, Matthew.
Hello, Robin.
Thanks for accepting this invitation to our interview where we would like to discuss the upcoming ESPR regulation and some stuff related to the topic such as DPP, a digital product passport. I'm really glad that we have you on this call because I consider you as one of the best experts in this field. So I'd like to, if you can share us some sort of knowledge that you have on this field with our audience. This is the space where you can briefly introduce yourself, and then we will switch for some Q&A session prepared.
Absolutely. And thank you very much for having me, Robin. And just to briefly introduce myself, so I'm working with Protokol today, and I've been working with them since April. And I'm working as a strategic engagements manager for our digital product passport portfolio. I've been working in both with our customer cases and also in developing our partner network. And before that, I was working a lot with circular economy topics. So I was working in a large company and working in developing new business ideas from a sort of circular economy concepts and testing innovative concepts such as digital product passport within those businesses.
All right, thank you for the introduction. Let me start with the first question. What exactly is this digital product passport, and how does it work in practice?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that we're going to go through in terms of sort of the details of digital product passport, but on a sort of simple level, the DPP, the digital product passport, is referred to it many times as DPP. It is a digital kind of label or a digital version of a product. It can take a lot of different forms depending on kind of the detail of it, but ultimately is an information set about a product that helps that is connected to a product through something like a QR code so that someone can access information about that product. That could be information like you could normally see on a label, but much more information about the product, what type of materials are in it, how you should take care of the product in a good way, how you can recycle that product. A lot of different information can be added there. So that is essentially what the digital product passport is.
All right. What are because I can understand that this will be a really complex topic and a very complex solution. So what are the core components of DPP and how it can be integrated into the existing product management systems?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of ways to kind of break down what DPP is. And one way is dividing it in two parts. And that is the data that exists in the DPP as one part, and the DPP system as another part. And if we look at those two sort of separately, so the system is kind of the architecture that allows the DPP to exist. And that can take a number of forms, and it can integrate with a number of other systems, as you mentioned. And that architecture allows the second part, which is the data, to sort of flow through that and reach and also come from a number of different endpoints there. So those would be sort of the two kind of components. And when it comes to integrating with solutions, like many other softwares, sort of integration is relatively standard for a system, but there's a number of different ways that it could be integrated. So it can be integrated to take data from, like you said, ERP systems or product management systems, but it can also be used to share information. So for example, a digital product passport can be used also as an input for the next digital product passport that is the product after that, if it is a component, for example. So those integrations can vary a lot and will depend a lot on sort of what type of stakeholders are looking to interact with the digital product passport.
All right. Speaking about the companies themselves and mentioning the data, which kind of data should the business track and share through these systems, either from, through the softwares or this labeling stuff?
So that can vary quite a lot. There is a sort of baseline, and we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about the legislation in a second. But on a sort of basic level, a company can put almost anything they want in the digital product passport in terms of information. So there's not a lot of limits actually in terms of what can be put there. It can be put sort of text, it can be put images, it can be put links, and it can be also sort of interactive functions built into the digital product passport that allows someone that is interacting with that product or that DPP to, for example, input information or communicate through the digital passport with the company that manufactured it, for example. So there's a number of creative ways businesses can actually aim to use the DPP, and outside of the sort of basic requirements, which will be a lot about the materials that are in the product, kind of how it was produced, where it was produced, and any safety concerns related to it, any information that would be valuable for the product to remain in its intended life cycle as long as possible.
All right, you have mentioned in that we'll go there in the second part related to the legislation. But can you share us right now if there are some list of the requirements to the data that should be disclosed and will be mandatory to disclose related to the sustainability legislation?
So we know on a sort of high level what the requirements for data could be, but the reality is the legislation is sort of partly finished. So we only have kind of that high level version. For most products, except for industrial batteries, we don't actually know yet what specific data needs to be there, but we have an idea. So like I mentioned, there'll very likely for most products be requirements to disclose what materials are in the product, especially if there's a potential for hazardous materials. There will be a disclosure needed for that. But just in general, what is the product made of? Because the purpose behind that is so that it can be more easily recycled at the end of life, right? Other aspects. So I think it's maybe important to zoom out actually before I go further and look at the kind of the purpose for DPP, right? Why we're even talking about DPP? What is the reason why there's legislation? And that is really that the DPP is really aims to be used to enable a more circular economy and used as a tool to enable circular business, but also to more efficiently enable things that exist today, like recycling and sort of reuse, by creating more transparency to what is the product itself, like what materials are in it. And then if we come to something else, which is more about how the product should be used in the best way, what's like its expected lifetime, how it's expected to be used properly to make sure that it maintains quality as long as possible, but then also how to fix it or how to recycle it. So everything in terms of data requirements will be aimed with that kind of end goal in mind, to make sure that the product itself can be lasting as long as possible or lasting for its intended use, and then effectively circulate within the economy the product itself, or iterations of that product, or ultimately the materials in that product can continue to be a part of a circular economy as long as possible. All of the data requirements will be aiming to essentially to kind of serve those purposes outside of things like safety and other compliance things like that.
Speaking of the transition to circular economy, can the DPP be able also to contribute to carbon emission reduction? And if yes,
so the DPP itself is not actively contributing in that way for, if you're saying, if we're talking about traditional ways to kind of reduce carbon, for example, in your operational efficiency. But the process of creating a DPP can be a a good process to get transparency within your organization and your operations and supply chain. Where are things that could be improved to reduce our carbon emissions? So the process of creating the DPP can expose some of those potentially low-hanging fruit or just hot spots for companies to be able to move towards lower carbon emissions or other sustainability goals. But if we look at also sort of lowering carbon through new business opportunities, so using the digital product passport outside of the sort of traditional linear economy function and looking more at how it can enable circular business, so how to more efficiently be able to take your products back for recycling or for repair, or to build, product as a service models with your products through using the digital product passport as a tool. That can be a way ultimately to reduce or create low carbon businesses, if we say it like that. So the DPP is not really a tool for directly influencing your operations, but it can be used as a tool for your business ultimately to create a more sort of sustainable functioning business models.
So besides the material, let's say, flow of these products and these disclosures behind that, there is certain level using of this kind of systems even for energy efficiency, resources, and carbon emissions as well, right?
Yeah. So I mean, ultimately, again, the DPP is not directly used to influence efficiency, but it can be used to document efficiency. So it's ultimately a tool for transparency of information, for sharing information, which is a great way to improve efficiency, because you can't improve something if you don't understand what's actually happening. So it's a great way to kind of sort of pack information about a product in one place that can be shared easily then with any stakeholder that's relevant to that efficiency that you're trying to improve. So I think in that aspect, the DPP can definitely be used to improve efficiencies in your value chain.
Is it the goal with this DPP implementation also to target the final consumers, like the users of the product, and how they can get those informations about the product from the systems?
Yeah, so the consumers are definitely a big part. So for example, one use case of the DPP would be if you're in the store buying a product, that you could see a lot of the information about that product, but also be able to compare it from let's say a sustainability perspective to the product next to it. So you can see directly the carbon emissions of those two products. And as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of like a digital label. I mean, you can only put so much information on a product label. The DPP gives a whole new sort of breadth, a new amount of information that you can share at the point of sale, for example. So that would be one use case. Another would be if someone actually owns a product and they can access, for example, manuals on how to use the product in a good way, how to wash if it's closed, for example. And again, coming back to when they're done with that product, or they're done just when they buy it and we're done with the packaging, you can get information about how do I recycle this effectively? Or, if companies want to engage in kind of loyalty programs with their customers, allow their customers to kind of like trade or resell products effectively. And so a lot of different creative ways can be done, that can be used to allow consumers to kind of engage with products and their life cycles in ways that we can't efficiently to do.
All right. So me as a customer, how I will get to this information? So I can imagine that there will be some sort of QR code to scan it, or there's some code to point me to the open database of all those disclosed information about this product.
Yeah, so there's a number of different what we call data carriers that could be used, and a QR code is one of those such data carriers. It will probably be the most common one, at least initially, for DPP, because everyone is familiar with it in terms of the consumer, and it's also very accessible with your mobile phone. In the future, we'll probably see more RFID used as a data carrier. Especially once that technology becomes more available in phones in terms of reading. But you can also find NFC tags, which is what you have, for example, in your phone for Apple Pay or your credit card. It's a very short range radio frequency that you can use to scan something. So that could also be used as a data carrier. It'll be the preference, or can be chosen by the manufacturer that releases the product and has the DPP, which kind of data carrier they feel is best suited. Or it can be also a multitude of data carriers. You can have multiple ones used that are going to the same digital product passport.
All right. So from your experience, you are expecting to using the RFID tags in the near future as the most common thing, maybe combined with the QR code, or because right now the mobile phones can read the NFC codes, if I'm not wrong, but it will also depends on the final stakeholder, if it's the customer itself, or it will be some part of business partner through the value chain, and it can be different, right?
Yeah, it can, and I think that's the point that you brought up with being sort of different stakeholders potentially kind of needing different types of access. The challenge is, like, a QR code is great if you're interacting with one product, right? And you have time to kind of take out your phone and scan it. If we talk about sort of another use case that the DPP is meant for, which is to enable more efficient recycling, no recycling process is going to be efficient if you have to scan a QR code for every item to understand what's in that, right? So you need to be able to scan very quickly a large group of products and sort them quickly, whether that be by robot or fast conveyor belt. There's multiple systems that could be used there, but you need a much broader sort of macro scanning type of a system, and there RFID is very good, and that's why I expect that RFID will be used in tandem a lot with QR codes, and once it becomes more accessible in terms of reading to consumers, I think it will actually phase out QR codes to some extent. But I think for a long time, we'll actually probably see some combination of data carriers together.
All right. Thanks for clarification. It's also better for me to imagine that how it will work in practice. Let's talk about a little bit the relation to the regulation, because I believe that you with the protocol are also part of the legislation creation group. My question is how it's related to the eco design or ESPR regulation and how it will affect each other.
Yeah, so the ESPR, or the Eco Design for Sustainable Products regulation that was accepted by the EU during this summer, it is essentially the sort of introduction, the framework regulation for digital product passports in the EU. It introduced the concept of what DPP is. It introduces sort of some of the other things I was mentioning earlier in terms of the purpose of DPPs and the data requirements. The ESPR as a whole is not only about DPP, it's about how to steer companies into designing products in a more sustainable way, but the DPP is a very big component of that. And so it is the introduction to the DPP, and what will happen now is there'll be a number of other regulations that will be introduced that are kind of under the umbrella, so to speak, of the ESPR that will give more specific rules and standards to specific product categories and to how this DPP system should function on a more detailed level. So that work is ongoing. We have some information now. We'll be getting more information from the EU during the beginning of next year about kind of what the roadmap will look like in terms of more specific timelines. But right now, today, we know that this will be coming, and the first DPPs will be required starting in 2027. And the first product categories that will be required to have DPPs are industrial batteries, like car batteries or large batteries used in industry.
All right, so it will be mandatory for companies to have it DPP in place.
Yes, I think when all is said and done, in sort of, let's say, 10 years or so, I don't think there's going to be too many different product categories that won't be required to have a DPP in the EU. This is just the direction that's going. We have a priority list from the EU, which already contains quite a lot of different categories of products and materials. And then there's also existing category regulations, such as toys and construction products, that are separate regulations, but are now being introduced with new drafts of those regulations that include requirements for using DPP. So I think this is going to be a very widespread requirement across many, many product categories already by 2030.
All right. So can you namely say which kind of industries, not the product, because we can be here like till the evening, but at least some industries that will be affected and is already on the timeline? You mentioned the batteries for the automotive industry. So which else?
Yeah, so this is a little bit loosely defined by the EU because sometimes they define a product like a battery, and sometimes they're talking about materials like textiles and steel and aluminum. So it'll be interesting to see how exactly they will create that sort of those lines. Textiles is on the agenda, specifically consumer textiles, so clothes, potentially like other home textiles like sheets and curtains and things like that. All that has been less clear, but clothes for sure are on the agenda, priority one. That will probably be the first delegated act that will be following the batteries. There's also been a lot of talk about furniture, about electronics, which includes anything that has an electronic component. So it can be appliances, can be consumer electronics, it can be large industrial machines, and then anything that's containing electronic component, which is a lot of things. A large percentage of what we have in our society today has some electronic component. And then there's also been mention about some other material categories like steel and aluminum, which are significant for a lot of industries as well, particularly automotive, like you mentioned, aerospace, and things like that, heavy equipment, construction, yes. And then I also mentioned, toys and construction products and also detergents. All of those are not mentioned necessarily under the ESPR, but have now been their existing regulations for the safety of those product categories has now been redrafted to include requirements for digital product passport. So as it looks now, toys, construction products, and detergents also are falling under that umbrella. So right there, we're already covering quite a lot, and that's only just been what's been set on the agenda currently.
Will there be any potential penalties or risk for companies if they fail to comply with either eco-design or implementing DPP once they will become mandatory?
Yes. Yeah, there will be penalties. There's no specifics on what the penalties look like yet, but there will definitely be penalties. So you'll be wanting to comply with this for sure.
All right. And it will affect all size of companies, I guess, through the value chain, no matter of.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. All right. So how the DPP can help actually companies to comply with those regulations, and if there is any connection also to the current CSRD regulation.
So, the digital product passport itself is required as a component of compliance to the ESPR, but it is actually going to be used as a tool to enable compliance in other ways for other categories. So I mentioned before toys and detergents. Those type of products that have some kind of compliance component today with respect to the disclosure of certain chemicals that should not be in the products. The digital product passport can be used as a storage or a tool to document the compliance with other regulations outside of the ESPR. So it is required itself as a baseline compliance for the ESPR, but it can be used as a way to more easily, more efficiently comply with other existing regulations today. Can also be used as a tool that makes import of products into the EU easier. Because again, all the documentation can be stored. Someone at the border, at the import control as the EU can quickly identify information about the product. There doesn't need to be paperwork and digital emails and things like that exchange. Everything can be stored and communicated through the DPP, which will make things actually will save companies money in the long run.
All right, we have jumped to one of my questions, because a lot of companies currently sees all those regulation and legislation as an administrative burden and pure evil stuff. So my question is, and you have mentioned it in some part, how the DPP can create value for those businesses in different sectors, particularly with the big ones with a huge supply chains.
Yeah, so there's actually a number of ways that the DPP can create value and not ultimately be a cost. But I think it's important for companies to understand that this can take time, and that the DPP is kind of the first step that towards kind of really enabling circular business models to be more possible. So today you do have a lot of businesses starting out offering product as a service. We see increased sort of business in the recycling industry, particularly in sort of like niche recycling or small batch recycling. But it's difficult for those companies today to kind of operate in a world that is existing in the old way, the linear economy way, where products are made and disposed of. So I think the best value that the DPP can provide is existing within the context of actually a more functional circular economy, and that will take time to really come to fruition. But that is kind of the goal. And in that scenario, the DPP is creating a lot of value for companies because it is enabling a lot of those concepts to take place. Because a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about circular business models is transferring information from one sort of user or stakeholder to the next in an effective way, and being able to also sort of add information over time to sort of document any relevant information to the product. So, but that being said, there's ways today that companies can get value from the DPP. For example, just on a very basic level, DPP can be a kind of marketing tool. It's a great way for companies, especially companies operating with sustainability as a core part of what they're offering to their customers. It's a great way to communicate exactly how your products are sustainable. So you can show a much more detailed information and give consumers or your customers more background information about how you've calculated your sustainability or what is actually sustainable about your product. So it's a great way to communicate, also to engage with your customers. I mentioned kind of loyalty programs can be done using the DPP. So that is one way that it creates value. But I mean, also we touched on earlier how companies can improve their sort of efficiency or address their sustainability goals. If their goals are related to, for example, ensuring that a certain number of their products are recycled, for example, the DPP can really help to achieve that goal. So I think it's important for companies to really reflect on what are they doing today, or what ambitions do they have, especially in relation to any kind of circular economy activity or ambition or sustainability initiatives, and look at how can a DPP potentially help make the process to reaching that goal more efficient. And I think there's a lot of different opportunities to be done there. It can be quite a little bit different on case to case, depending on exactly how things look for the company, but that would be a good place to kind of start workshopping if you want to look for value creation.
Would you see DPP have ability to help to companies with the scope 3 reporting? For example, this is a very huge part for a lot of companies to get the right information through their supply chain and have the proper scope 3 assessment. Do you see that DPP can help with this?
It can potentially be used in that way. It's not necessarily what it's built for, but it is a tool for sharing information. So it's a great way to kind of standardize a information sharing exchange. But there's other systems I think that could be used more effectively in that regard. But I know that one of the challenges that companies have in their supply chains or value chains is everyone's using kind of different templates and different programs and things like that to share information. So DPP could be a way to kind of really standardize that exchange. And, so then if I'm one company producing a material, I can create a DPP for that bag of material that then gets shipped to the next partner, and they can take that information that's in that DPP and essentially directly include it into their reporting or into their system that's doing the reporting. But that can also be then added to the DPP for their product directly. So it becomes kind of a DPP of DPPs, ultimately, if we talk about products and then components there. So there's some ways that can be done, but it would require that everyone is using the DPP. So there's no kind of shortcuts there, but it can be a good way to package information and share it in a kind of standardized way.
Exactly. It makes sense to me to have it all in one place and not just spread out to multiple platforms or software. So that's why I'm asking. You mentioned the cost. I know it will be really individual, but can you approximately tell us the initial cost for implementing DPP system to the company?
It's very difficult to say. It will depend a lot on the company size. And to be honest, there's still a lot of unknowns when it comes to how the DPP sort of service will need to operate under the regulation. So there's still standardization going on. There's a number of requirements that service providers like Protokol will need to abide by to also help companies comply with the regulations. So there needs to be copies of the DPP stored to comply. It needs to be accessible in a DPP database that's centralized in the EU. There's a number of sort of data access restrictions that need to be built into the system that are not fully defined yet by the EU, which will quite dramatically affect cost. And so it's very difficult to say. It can range a lot, but it will be somewhere in the range of what companies generally pay for sort of software services today. I mean, the DPP sort of software in itself, the architecture is not super unique or unlike other types of sort of data management softwares that exist today.
All right, practically speaking, I'm the owner of the company, and I want to implement this DPP, and I want to buy the system. How will I do it to make sure that entire my value chain will put those information into the system that I will see on my process? Because I can imagine that there will be a lot of different solutions, a lot of different softwares, but there should be some united database for those information that all of them would be putting in the data.
So what the EU does not want is that you end up with these very centralized solutions where, like you said, I would have to force my entire supply chain to use some kind of software. So actually what will happen is that there'll be a standardized kind of playing field, if we call it like that. And that will mean that if I'm, company X supplying to company Y, we can be using two different sort of DPP solutions, but still allow company X to share their DPP efficiently with company Y. So there will be a standardized way for that data exchange to take place from one company to the other. So it won't require companies to coordinate in terms of the software, but they will have to coordinate in terms of, so industries have a lot of work to do, some industries at least, to figure out how the sort of what things are called, what a certain data field or point should be referred to, so that everyone's calling something for referring to something the same way. So if I say carbon footprint, I'm going to use the same calculation method and also the same units and everything that you will use when you say carbon footprint, because otherwise you lose that ability to just easily transfer information from one system to another. Then you need to have a lot of manual intervention, and that won't be good. So there's actually a lot of work going on now, also both in the sort of official channels of the EU, but also in a number of EU funded projects to essentially help figure out, just to start coming up with these kind of standards for nomenclature of.
Can you explain me one technical question? How those data will be verified?
That ultimately is the responsibility of the company putting the product on the market. So there's no, as is written now, it says that companies are responsible to ensure that the data is accurate, but there's no.
Can the blockchain technology can help with the verification of those data, or how it is working?
I mean, blockchain itself can create a very trustworthy documentation of data input and data change over time. So if something is changed, you'll see exactly how and when it was changed and by who, but it doesn't ensure the validity of the data. So it doesn't ensure the quality. It can't. Someone could still put phony data into the blockchain and it's still phony. It's there's nothing, the DPP, there's no way to solve that. Companies can always still lie until they're audited in the same way that they're audited today. So I think it remains a little bit up in the air how the EU wants to address the data quality issue. But I think their main priority right now is just to get information out there and get products having DPPs. And I think the next step that we'll see kind of coming more and more over time is how do we improve the data quality that's within the DPP? But the first step is not to put too many barriers there just to get things going, right? And companies can always, there's different levels. And I know you guys talk a lot, for example, about, how calculating LCAs and things like that, and corporate calculating ESG. Things can be done on different levels of accuracy, right? And companies don't always have the granularity of data that they would want, but it's usually better to get something than just wait for the perfect data, right? So get something out there, even though it's imperfect, even though it has a window that is of error, and then just improve it when you can. Improve that data over time. And I think that's the way to kind of look at it. Let's get the data out there that we have, and then over time work to improve the quality of that data.
So what steps should this ESG executive or sustainability executive should take today to prepare for upcoming regulation or implementation of DPP?
So the first step is to understand what the requirements are, and that's to make sure that you meet those levels. And that can mean reading the regulation, talking to consulting companies, for example, like Protokol, and getting a good understanding of what is going to be required, and as much as possible understand when that needs to be. And then the next step is to then look at where is your company at today in terms of readiness. So how much of that data that we're talking about do you actually have? Where is that information today? And kind of create like a kind of a gap analysis, essentially where you're at today versus where you need to be, and then create a plan for how you're going to get there from A to B in the time that you have. And then additionally, like we talked about, beyond that, as the sort of bare minimum requirement, look at with your business units, with your executives and your strategy team, look at how could we use the DPP as a tool for our business to create value as a differentiator potentially with our customer base, and explore ways that can be done as well.
What do you see that will be main challenges for businesses adopting this DPP systems?
I think one issue that we see very common, and I know very well myself being in a large company before, is that the DPP will actually require quite a lot of coordination, both within an organization, but also then within their value chain, both primarily a lot with their supply chain, but also with downstream actors like their customers, and understanding how they want to use the DPP. But at the basic level, we just look at an organization. You're going to need a significant engagement from your sustainability team. They're probably leading this initiative from a sustainability compliance perspective. You're definitely going to need engagement from your IT team, as this is essentially a digital component of your offering. And then you're going to need, for example, engagement from your sourcing team, because you're going to have a lot of discussions with suppliers and making sure that you getting the right data from them. And then, of course, you're going to need budgets. So you're going to need your leadership team engaged in understanding what you're doing, what is required. So I think that is actually going to be one of the biggest challenges is getting the ball rolling with all of these parts that have their day jobs. They're doing other stuff on a day-to-day basis. This can be a quite big undertaking. And I think also then being able to communicate internally the urgency or what is this new thing that we're having to do now, that is DPP. And it becomes not just something you do once, but it's actually something you have to manage continuously over time, right? So this becomes quite an integrated part of your whole business operation ultimately. And that's not something you can just, do overnight. So, I mean, coming back to how companies prepare, running pilots is another key component for getting ready. So don't try and just go from, 0 to 100 all in one step. Work with, service providers to run pilots and stress test your system. The software itself is one part, but like we talked about earlier, I mean, the data itself is a big part of this equation, and that ultimately companies are responsible for themselves. So I think getting the data that they need, getting the organization and other stakeholders engaged, those are the key challenges for organizations in preparing for DPP.
Speaking of these pilots, how it can look like, how should I imagine that, like focusing on one product, or what is the best approach to implement the pilot program?
So there can be a number of ways, of course. From our perspective, a good way is to focus on something that is scalable. So something that can be built upon, not something that you do and then you throw away and then you start fresh for the full implementations. We would normally look at, from Protokol, we would normally look at doing with like one or two products and kind of really trying to go through the full process as much as possible with readily available information to create the DPPs for those products and really see, okay, how did that go? Who do we need to be more engaged? What data is missing? How are we going to create that data? And how could we make this implementation smoother when we go full scale with this? For example, operations also have to be engaged, as I even mentioned that before, but DPP is not just a digital component. It's actually it's tied physically to the product. So you need to connect in your operations of production every product to a DPP, which is another layer of coordination that needs to happen there. So this can take a lot more time than companies think. And even though I mentioned 2027 is the first horizon, it's not too early now. I think for especially medium and large companies with a lot of suppliers, a lot of especially complex products, there's no harm in running a scalable pilot now. Even if it goes well, then you say, okay, then we just, park this and we know roughly how long it'll take and we'll start our full implementation in a few months or a year. You don't really lose anything in doing that because you're going to have to do it anyway.
So would you recommend to companies to start right now, or to wait for final version of this ESPR and then act?
We sell a solution for DPP, so of course I want everyone to
come
and start using that.
As an expert.
But I think the key is for companies to start preparing now, especially preparing internally. And there's it doesn't even have to be necessarily DPP focused. There's things that can be done already today that will help for DPP, but that companies should be kind of doing anyway, which is reassessing your digitalization strategy, your data management strategy, what type of platforms you're using to manage your information about your products and so on. And also LCA is a key component of DPP. It's going to be required probably for most products to have an LCA done that will be kind of shared in the DPP. So I think that's actually a really great place to start. LCA is much more familiar to companies than DPP, even though for some companies it's still quite sort of alien. The information that you need to do an LCA and the information that you get from doing an LCA makes up a very big chunk of actually what is going to be in the DPP itself. We did a rough assessment of the battery regulation, which is the only one we have with specific data points, and estimate approximately 40% of the information that's going to be required in the DPP in terms of number of points, not total volume of information. But 40% of the points that are required are addressed in doing an LCA exercise. So that would be a great place to start. Actually, if companies don't have an LCA, start with that. That gets you a big step forward. But in general, don't hesitate to start reaching out to service providers like Protokol to get the answers that you need, and also to start kind of get the ball rolling within your organization in terms of sharing the information there.
Mm-hmm. Great answer. Thank you. I will get back a little bit. Like you said, that company needs to be ready also on the technical level and working with their IT teams. The implementing of these technologies, or will there be any kind of special technologies be necessary for implementing DPP?
Outside of the DPP sort of software itself, not really. But there's no sort of new technology being introduced here. There's a new architecture in terms of standard architecture of the DPP solution. But like I mentioned before, there's nothing super new about that in itself. But if we look at how that connects to what companies have today or will need to have, it's all standard. So we can connect directly to ERP systems, PLM systems. When it comes to printing the QR codes, you can use your standard or other data carriers. If you want to go to something like an RFID or NFC, and you don't use that today, that would be an additional step that will be sort of added. But if you're using just a QR code, you just put that on your label of the product, assuming that will be okay. We actually don't know yet if they will require specific placement of the data carriers, which that could be the case. So we'll have to see when specific acts are released. Yeah. That will be part of the act, is them saying you can put it on the label or you have to put it in a particular place on the product. But in general, QR codes are just an image that you can kind of use any standard technology for in your operation. So in general, on bare minimum, there's no additional requirements. If you have the data, it can be almost plug and play, to be honest.
All right. Seems feasible for the companies.
Yes. More or less.
Great to know. Another question: how the ESG executive with the technology providers and regulatory bodies to ensure that the organization can stay ahead of coming eco-design regulation and the DPP? How they can work with such providers as, for example, Protokol?
Yeah, I mean, just reach out. Ultimately, we are happy to inform companies about what's required, and that is outside of what we're selling. So we are engaged in helping the market kind of develop and prepare, and then of course we have the solution to meet the needs there. But ultimately we are engaged in really building a sort of information sharing economy with respect to preparing for the ESPR compliance.
So besides the implementation of the technology, you can also advise the companies with the whole process and how they should implement it with the company.
Yeah, absolutely. So on a basic level, in terms of just understanding the legislation on a general level, we provide that. Anyone can book an introduction call with me, and I'm happy to answer any questions on that. And then in addition to that, we do provide a range of kind of consulting services to help different companies prepare, engage with stakeholders, like we talked about earlier, being a challenge. We're really working to kind of work around that to help companies get their organization on board and start preparing. So there's a kind of a range of services from very basic all the way through to fully implementing the digital passport, product passport solution that we offer.
All right. So finally, we have this promotion window in this interview for you as well. Yes. So tell me, Matt, the final question: which kind of projects you already implemented or done? Because this is a really new topic. Do you have already some systems in place and some examples that the companies can take the example of?
So Protokol so we have not any completed DPP projects yet. We have actually a number of engagements ongoing, and we're looking at a number of different pilots that will be run already in the first half of next year. And we're quite rapidly taking on more and more engagements that we're turning into pilots. So that's very exciting, and we're very looking forward to really getting in and learning more about the specifics of how implementation will work for different companies. We do see a lot of uniqueness when it comes from case to case. That's another good reason to run pilots as well for companies, to make sure that there's a system that is working for them, and it's not just a one size fits all, that there's tweaks that we can make that make it work particularly for them. So yeah, like I said, we're really looking at driving pilots right now because the legislation is a little bit unfinished. So we have a pilot-based solution that is built for running pilots and or sort of smaller projects, and then we'll be, ramping up our development alongside the EU regulations as they're released over the next year.
All right. So I think that's all from our side. So let's wrap up. Thank you very much, Matthew, for your insights. Really on really comprehensive topic that DPP is. I'm really excited to see the first implementation of these systems in place. And yeah, happy to chat about that once it will be finally adopted and we'll have more information on the regulation basis.
Thanks a lot, Robin. It was a really fun discussion.
Right. Thank you, Matt. Bye.
Thank you. Take care.
We have lost Lucas, my colleague, so hopefully